Such an honor to be here today and with Chuck and Taryn, two of our favorite people on the planet. When Chuck said, he reached out to me a few months ago and said, would you be able to come over? And we were, yes. We didn't even look at our diary. We were just, yes, we can come. They're such humble leaders, and as we've been able to be with them several days this week, and they invited us into their home even, and they just care deeply about you. They care about what God is doing in your lives. They care about this church and what God is up to. And I love seeing that. Now, I have to say, Sherry and I, we very much love England. We love the UK. We might love England the most, but don't tell anybody else. We first came about 15 years ago. We met Chuck and Taryn at that time, and we get to come over about once or twice a year. And I've told some people, I think I was supposed to have been born British, okay? My name is spelled Geoffrey, which no one in America spells Geoff that way. My mom has never been to England, but I think she meant me to be born in England. Some people have even said I have a British sense of humor, which I take as a huge compliment. But I know I'm not supposed to be British because I cannot drive on your roads. I hire a car every time we come over, and every time it is helpful because Sherry is much closer to Jesus now than she was earlier. Because I hear her over and over again, please Jesus, save us. We love being here. Love what we're learning about Verso. And to be here today, I was asking Chuck said there's somewhere between 80 and 85 nations represented in this one church. That's awesome. Well, I need to check real quick. Any Americans? Okay, 86, all right. Because Sherry and I are from Denver, and we said that. My wife Sherry is here with us, and she's an amazing speaker. You would have been better off to hear from her, but I got in front of the line and got ahead of her, so I get to. We have a couple of kids. Today's Father's Day in the U.S. as well, and so I'm missing my kids, Mike and Hillary. They're both grown, or Mike and Brittany. They're both grown. They're both married. Mike married to Hillary, Brittany married to Freddie, and they're lovely. We love them, miss them. We're going to celebrate when we get back, but they matter not that much because what matters is we have grandkids, right? Any other grandparents here? You know what I'm saying, right? Exactly. Kids were fine. We're glad we didn't kill them because we have better ones now. 4 grandkids. We have 2 girls and 2 boys, and they're just the delight of our lives. They live about 20 minutes from us, and we spend as much time as we can with them. And I miss them. I miss my dad. My dad's 92. My dad was a pastor. My dad just gave up his teaching his Bible study the other day, and I did the math. My dad had been preaching or teaching for 77 years when he gave up his Bible study. But love being here, and I love being here on Father's Day because normally on Father's Day I go to church and then I spend the rest of the afternoon barbecuing. And I like barbecuing. My wife knows I like it because I have 3 monstrous barbecues and I like doing it, but it's a lot of work to do it for the entire family. Today when we're done, Chuck and Taryn have said we're going for a lovely Sunday roast and someone else cooked it. So that is phenomenal. But before we dive in today, I understand you're having to translate an American accent, and I will say some things today that make no sense to you, and I apologize for that. But I don't want you to hear me. I want us to hear from God. So would you pray with me as we dive in? Father, it's just such an honor today, and we honor you as we talk about Father's Day. But Lord, I thank you for just the honor and privilege to be on this amazing platform at this church, Lord. Lord, it's humbling to know that my job is to share your word and to speak in your presence. So Lord, I pray you'll speak through me. Maybe if you're listening, you might pray a prayer. We pray this every single Sunday at my church. Lord, I'm here. I'm listening. Speak to me. Maybe you'll pray this for someone sitting next to you. Maybe you know them, maybe you don't, but just pray maybe something like this. Lord, I pray for the one next to me. I pray that they will listen and that they will have the wisdom and courage to respond to you. Lord, we ask it in your name. Amen. So Father's Day makes me feel a little bit nostalgic, thinking about growing up as a kid. And I try to be as humble as I can, which is not a word Americans use a lot, but I try. But I have some amazing skills. And I want to share some of those skills. I think we have a slide that illustrates some of those skills. So in the middle is that, many of you don't know what that is. That's called a telephone. I know how to use it. I can dial a number on that telephone. On the other side, there's the black and red with all of that coming out of it. I can do two things with that. That's a cassette tape. I can make a mixtape. Any of you know how to do that? Mixtape? There's my people. I also know how to take a number 2 pencil, which you don't know what that is. And I know how to re-spool the cassette tape, which you don't know how to do. Yeah. I also know how to ruin a marriage and a relationship trying to drive using the other thing, which is a folding map. I can read a map, I can dial a telephone, and I can re-spool a cassette tape. Skills that are of no use whatsoever. They will never be of use again. If we had to go with a paper map while we have been in the UK, we would have died on Tuesday. But it makes me wonder what else is no longer going to be important. As we see society and information increase and now AI, and is there a point in time where not just the skills I have, but will I become obsolete? How do I honor the legacy that was passed on to me from my grandfather and my father? How do I pass that on to my kids and my grandkids? What am I leaving for the next generation? And I wonder about you, do you ever stop to think about your legacy? What will be here when you are gone? What are you building that will bear fruit after you are with Jesus in heaven? And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to look at a guy that if you've been around church, you're familiar with in the Old Testament called Daniel. And if you have your Bible with you, you can open it to Daniel. We'll have the verses on the screen, but we're going to look a lot at the book of Daniel. But he is a man who left an incredible legacy. Now, his story begins with challenges. Daniel was taken as a slave into another country when he was 16 years old. And when they captured him and took him to the country, they made him a eunuch. And I'm not going to explain that today. That'll be a fun conversation with the kids over lunch today. I'm just going to say it's not a good thing. He was made a eunuch. He was forced to serve Nebuchadnezzar, the very man who destroyed his homeland and killed his family. Daniel had no money, and he really had no real power, and yet his legacy is incredible. Later in the Old Testament, the prophet Ezekiel calls Daniel one of the 3 most righteous men to ever live. Jesus quotes Daniel as a great prophet. He leaves a legacy that thousands of years later still influences people. People all over the world know some of the stories we'll talk about today about Daniel. And so what we'll do is we're going to talk about 4 stories. We're going to talk about four things we learned, 4 building blocks for a legacy, and then we're going to finish by saying, what does that mean to me? So let's dive into the first story. The first story is a meal. So the kingdom of Judah is defeated by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians take the best and brightest of mostly the young men and take them as slaves into the king's palace. And the goal here is to take all of Babylon is conquering the world, really, and they want to bring the best and the brightest. They want to educate them, and then they want to turn them into useful servants in that kingdom. And so Daniel is captured, his friends are captured, they're taken to the palace, and they're educated and groomed for leadership. And part of this program is they're given the best food in the kingdom. And a banquet of meats and fruit and delicacies from around the world is put before them. And I don't know if buffet is a big thing here. I love a buffet because I just get all of everything that I want. And I start at the beginning and I get too much. And then I need another plate, to get the rest. But they have this banquet, this buffet before them. The problem is the food did not conform to Jewish law. Now, Daniel and his friends have been raised as very devout Jewish young men, and they know the law. But they look at this food and they realize we have been told by our faith, by our religion, that we should not eat. Stop right there. What would you do? Like, what would you do? You're in this foreign country. You are a servant. You are a slave. This food is put before you. It's amazing. It's like, wow. But you know it violates the principles that you grew up with. Maybe you would eat the food and ask for forgiveness later. Hey, sorry about that, God, but man, were those shrimp good? Or something like that. Prawns, sorry. Or maybe you would pretend to eat the food and just keep quiet about it. Sherry, when she was young, her mom would make fish fingers, okay? Sherry didn't like fish fingers. She wouldn't eat fish fingers. So she would take her fish fingers, and when her parents weren't looking, she would hide them behind the radiator, okay? Oh, you know where this story's going. In the summer, not a problem, but when it would get cold and those fish fingers had sat there for a little while and the radiator comes on and the smell of old fish begins to fill the house, she was discovered. Sherry would have hidden the food. But here's what Daniel did. In Daniel 1:8, it says that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. See, Daniel knew that his decision was bigger than just himself. He wasn't just making a decision that would impact him. He knew that the other young leaders that were captured with him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he knew that they were watching him. And so he lived by his convictions. And so our first building block, if we want to build a legacy, something that outlives us, is to have deep convictions, to live by our convictions. See, people who leave a legacy decide what they believe before they are tested. Daniel didn't, at that moment, decide what he believed about the food. He had decided ahead of time. People who build a legacy, they choose faithfulness over comfort and conviction over compromise. Daniel's convictions led to a legacy that outlived his challenges. And so we see the next few verses, we see the result of Daniel's stand. It says in verse 11, Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and as I can't say those names, you can't either, so we're on the same page. Here we go. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine, and they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. Which, by the way, did not make Daniel very popular with the other guys. However, he stood by his deep convictions. So story number one is the meal. Story number two is the dream. So Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of this empire, Babylon, he has a dream. And so he brings in all of his wise men and he says, okay, guys, I want you to tell me, what does the dream mean? And the wise men say, absolutely, we'll tell you. Tell us what the dream is. And he says, no. That's not how this works. You tell me what I dreamed, and then you explain what that means to me. And if you can't do that, I'm going to put you all to death. You think your line manager's tough, right? Guess what your job is, and then do it really, really well. Well, Daniel hears about this, and he knows that not only the guys in the king's presence, but all of those in the palace, including him and his friends, are going to be put to death. So he sends word to Nebuchadnezzar that he, Daniel, will tell him his dream and he'll explain it. And here's what's interesting about this part of the story is at this moment, Daniel had no idea what the dream was. He had no idea what it meant. He was stepping out in faith. He was believing God will show up. God will act. I will move before I know what the next steps are going to be. And then God honored his faith and allowed him to interpret the dream. And that's our second building block of a legacy is bold faith. So we have deep convictions. We have bold faith. Daniel's faith enabled his legacy to outlive his fear. Extraordinary faith is common among people who leave legacies. In Hebrews 11:8, the writer says that by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. Look at this last phrase. Even though he did not know where he was going. I've thought about that a lot. I've thought about, what if I walked into Sherry and I said, hey, Sherry, I think God's leading us to a new place. And she would say, oh, yeah, let's talk about that. Let's pray about that. Let me hear about it. Where is it that you think God's leading us? And I said, no idea, but I think we should sell our home and just start heading east. That would not go well at all. That would not be a good conversation. But Abraham had that conversation with Sarah. The results of Daniel's faith when he told the king his dream and interpreted it is that the king then placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all the wise men. So Daniel stands on his faith. He steps out when he doesn't know what God's going to do. God shows up, and then Daniel becomes one of the leaders in the kingdom. So the first story, we talked about the meal. We talked about the dream. The next story is the party. So eventually Nebuchadnezzar dies, and his son Belshazzar becomes king, and Daniel is forgotten. Daniel winds up behind a desk. He's shuffling scrolls. He goes to endless meetings, and he's just another office worker in Belshazzar's kingdom. So Belshazzar throws a party. It is what we call in America a rager. The music is loud. The wine is flowing. People are making decisions they're going to regret tomorrow. Like, this is a wild, wild party. And then in the middle of the party, suddenly a hand appears out of nowhere. Not an arm, not a person, just a hand. And the finger begins to write on the wall. And I don't know about you guys, but nothing stops a party like a disembodied hand. So it writes on the wall. Everybody stops drinking. The music stops. They don't know what's going on. No one can read the writing. And suddenly, Belshazzar's mom, Nebuchadnezzar's wife, remembers Daniel. And she says, I remember this guy, and Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. I think he can interpret stuff. Let's go get this guy. So they go find Daniel. They bring him in to read the writing. And he's offered all kinds of gifts and a big job if he can do it. And Daniel turns down all the bribes, all the offers. And he doesn't mince words. He says to the most powerful man in the kingdom, a man who doesn't even know he exists, he reminds Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar's failure. He tells Belshazzar that he has made the same mistake, and then he reads the writing on the wall. He says, this is the inscription that was written, Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Here's what these words mean. Mene means God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. How would you like to deliver that message to your boss? Like, that would be a tough one to say, but the reality is Daniel stood on courageous truth. He didn't hide, he didn't shade it, he just said the truth. He was bold in his faith and he was courageous in truth. His commitment to truth meant that his legacy overcame his circumstances. And the Bible is full of people who spoke difficult truths. If you remember the story of David and Bathsheba, you remember the prophet Nathan, who had to come and confront David. And one of the phrases that stands out in the Bible is Nathan looking at the king and saying, you are that man. In the New Testament, we read about John the Baptist, and Herod had married his sister-in-law, and John the Baptist stood up to him and in front of the public said, that is not right. David wrote this in the Psalm 15. He says, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose way is blameless and who does what is righteous. Let me start that phrase again. The one whose way of life is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from the heart. That's what Daniel did. Daniel had this amazing faith. He stuck to his convictions. and he spoke the truth boldly. One more story. And this is the story that people all over the world know. Some of them know it and they don't even know where it came from. This is the story of the lions. Belshazzar dies the night of the party. He dies that night. Darius the Mede becomes the king. And now he rules. By the time we get to the story of the lions, Daniel is now 80 years old. He was captured when he was 16, so he's been living as a captive slave most of his life. He's now serving under his fourth king since being captured. And Daniel's just a normal guy. He's just a guy going to work every day, trying to do his job, trying to live his faith out in a faithless nation. He's once again made one of the top officials in the nation because he is a faithful person that can be relied on. But it didn't make him popular with the other government officials. They were jealous. And they went to Darius and they said, Darius, you are an amazing king. You're awesome. Here's what you should do. You should make a decree. You should make a law that if anyone prays to anyone in the kingdom except for you for 30 days, they get thrown into a den of lions. Now, I think it's interesting why they chose punishment by lion, right? I don't know. They had tried, if you know the story, they had tried to burn some of Daniel's friends up, but that didn't work. So they decided, well, maybe the lions will eat him. And so Darius loves this. That's great. I am so great. People should pray to me. All right, let's do that. So he signs this decree. And then it's interesting. Some guys go to tell Daniel, hey, did you hear about this decree? Did you hear about this law? And we pick up we pick it up in Daniel 6:10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. I love this picture. Daniel's 80 years old. He gets the news. He's an old man. He's faced death many, many times. Most of his friends that were captured with him have died of various things. And they tell him the news, Daniel, if you get caught praying to anyone but Darius, you're going to be thrown into the den of lions. You're going to die. And he goes, all right, thanks for letting me know. Let me know. I got to go. Where are you going? Oh, it's 3 o'clock. I pray at 3. I got to go pray. And I'm like, wait, hey, didn't you hear us? If you pray, you'll get thrown into the den of lions. And Daniel goes, yeah, I'm old. I'm not deaf. I heard you. But you're making me late. I got to go. And I think about Daniel climbing the stairs. I know when I climb the stairs, it sounds like somebody's playing the drums, like all the clicks and clacks. And he gets to the top of the stairs, and he goes into his prayer room. And this is the same room that he prays in every day, 3 times a day. He kneels at the same place that he kneeled every single day. And he opened his windows toward Jerusalem. And that's interesting to me. Why did he open his windows toward Jerusalem? Jerusalem was 500 miles away. When Daniel prayed, Jerusalem was in ruins. It had been abandoned for decades. Wild animals roamed the streets of Jerusalem. Why did Daniel pray facing Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem represented hope. And Daniel had never given up hope. So 3 times a day, he kneels in the same spot. He opens his windows toward Jerusalem, and he prays just as he had always done. And what's amazing is we know how his prayer began. His prayer began, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." And why do we know that that's how he started his prayer? Because that's called the Shema. And faithful Jewish men always started their prayer with the Shema. Faithful Jews almost always still, 2,500 years later, begin their prayer with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Daniel's faithfulness in prayer, his life was rooted in year after year after year of faithful prayer. The last building block of legacy is this idea of consistent prayer. Daniel has established prayer as such a habit in his life that he can't imagine not praying. This day is no different. He's done this every day for year after year after year. His legacy is built on his consistent prayer. There's incredible strength in that image. It reminds me of my grandfather. On Father's Day, I was thinking about Grandpa. And my grandfather grew up in the 1930s in America. And if you've seen old movies of the West in America or the Depression and how crazy, how wild it was, that was my grandpa. My grandpa grew up in the state of Oklahoma. He worked as a farmer. He didn't own the land. He just worked the land. And to make extra money, he made what we called moonshine, which was illegal in the 1930s in America. So he made moonshine and he sold it. And he sold it to roving gangs of guys who went around robbing banks. That's who my grandpa hung out with. My grandpa was a mean man. In fact, he was known as the meanest man in town. That was a label that he had. He would go every Saturday night to the barn dance, and he didn't dance, he fought. He went to fight. He carried a handgun, a pistol with him everywhere he went. And he told me this. He filed the works of the pistol down so that if he shot somebody, it had a hair trigger, it would fire first. That's who my grandfather was. He was a mean man, a dangerous man. One day he caught someone stealing whiskey from his still, from his moonshine, and he pulled out his gun, they pulled out their gun, and my grandfather got into a gunfight. And he shot a man in the elbow and crippled the man for life. The man shot him with a shotgun. There was a little tree in front of my grandpa, and it kept the buckshot from hitting his heart. And that's how he survived. That's who my grandpa was. But one day, my grandmother got really, really sick. In fact, she was going to die. The doctor said there's nothing else we can do for her. And so they sent her home. And my grandmother heard about a couple of ladies who were traveling through that part of Oklahoma, and they were doing what were called tent revivals. They would do church services just out in a wheat field, and people would come and listen to them. And my grandma heard about that, and she asked my grandfather to take her to this church thing. They had never been to church. They had no church connection at all. My grandfather thought, she's going to die. It's her dying wish. I'll take her. So he loaded her up in the car, and they went to this field, but my grandmother was too weak to get out. So they just sat in the car and they rolled down the windows and they could hear what was being said. And at the end of the sermon, one of the ladies preaching said, if you want to follow Jesus, if you want to become a Christ follower, just raise a hand. Well, my grandma in the car weakly raised her hand. She couldn't get out. She couldn't walk forward. No one saw it. She didn't know what following Jesus meant. She had no idea. She just knew that she had no other choices. She raised her hand, and then nothing happened. And so they drove home, but then she began to get better. And her health was beginning to be restored. And she told my grandfather, when I'm well enough, I want to go to church, and I want to go to the church that was sponsoring that revival. Well, that church was a crazy Pentecostal, charismatic, Vineyard church. Like they ran around and yelled and jumped and they did all the stuff, right? My grandpa said, no, I'll never do that. Said some other words I won't repeat. It was just bad. He stormed out of the house. He was so angry. And he was walking down a red clay street in a little village in Oklahoma. And this is my grandpa's story, not mine, but what he said is something knocked him on his face. And he fell face down in the dirt. And he thought that God was going to kill him. And he said, God, if you'll let me live, I'll figure out how to follow you. And he got up and he went back to the house and he told my grandma, we're going to go to that church. So they went. He figured out how to be a Christ follower. One of the things he did in that church, that they would raise their hands like we do here, right? And during the worship. Well, there were some ladies raising their hands and they were just keeping them up. And my grandfather thought, how do they do that? He pulled his watch out and started timing how long they could keep their hands. That was my grandfather. But he followed Jesus. Eventually, if you ever read The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck, that's my grandpa's story. They moved to California. They became farmers, and then he wound up in Northern California, and he wound up putting together enough money. He bought a little store and a gas station, and he got committed in the church. He became a lay pastor in the church, but he and his boys didn't follow Jesus. They were teenagers. My dad, my uncle, and every day at 1:00, my grandpa would go in the back of the store, and he'd begin to pray. But my grandpa somehow thought that God didn't hear too well. So he prayed at the top of his lungs. He just, oh God. You can imagine how that went over in the store. But he was praying for his boys. He was praying for his boys. God, you've got to get a hold of my boys. Get a hold of their hearts. And one by one, first my uncle, then my dad, they did commit their lives to Christ. And my grandpa felt that he was supposed to be a church planter. And he was kind of like Abraham. He said, it's supposed to be back in Oklahoma. I don't know where. God gave him a picture of a building. He didn't even know where that building was. He just saw this picture of an abandoned building in a wheat field. He sold the store, he loaded up their furniture, and they headed toward Oklahoma, and they just drove. They're driving through a wheat field, and my grandpa stops the truck, and he says, that's the building. They go, they find somebody who knows about the building. They said, it's abandoned, you can use it, whatever you want to do. And they started a little church, and my grandma started inviting the children to come and hear Bible stories, and built a church, and then he moved on and planted another church and planted another church. But my grandpa died at 70. And at 70, he knew he'd lived a better life than he started out. And he knew that his kids followed Jesus. But my grandpa never knew his legacy. His legacy was built on that prayer. I remember as a kid, we'd go see grandpa and grandma, and we'd stay with them. And at 1 o'clock, we'd have lunch, and at 1 o'clock, we would all go into the room, had a sofa, had a chair, and my grandpa would kneel down at his chair, and the kids, we'd kneel down at this scratchy sofa, and grandpa would begin to pray at the top of his lungs. And after about 3 minutes as a kid, I'd prayed everything I needed to pray. I was good to go. 30 minutes later, grandpa's still praying. I'd fall asleep with my face on that sofa. But my grandpa never saw his legacy. His son, my dad, became a pastor. His other son became a pastor. His daughter married a pastor. All their kids became pastors. All their grandkids became Christ followers and pastors. Today, across the world, there are over 25 or 30 different pastors speaking as I today, preaching to congregations that are all directly related grandkids of my grandpa. But what my grandpa never saw, and I'm not sure if we have a picture. I must not have got the picture there. I apologize. A few weeks ago, I stood and watched as my son, there it is, baptized my oldest granddaughter, my grandpa's great-great-granddaughter, being baptized. Why? Because this was a man who was faithful in prayer. This was a man who knew what his convictions were. He stood in faith and he spoke the truth. And that's the example I have. So let's finish Daniel's story. He was in trouble. He was praying. He got caught praying to God. And they go and tell Darius, and Darius throws him in the pit with the lions, and the next day Darius comes to see what happened. And it says in verse 19, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel answered, may the king live forever. May my God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions, and they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him. Why? Because he trusted in God. Because Daniel trusted in God, a powerful legacy was built. It was built on his deep convictions and on his bold faith and on courageous truth and on a consistent prayer. Now, most of us will never be called on to interpret a king's dream or to confront a king with his sins or to spend a night in a lion's den. Any night with cats is bad, but But every one of us will decide what kind of life we're building. Building a life that lives beyond us, a lasting legacy, it's rarely built in dramatic moments. It's built in one decision at a time. It's built in one conviction, one step of faith, one difficult truth, one prayer. This week, which building block needs your attention? Is God calling you to stand firm on a conviction? Is God calling you not to take a leap of faith, but a step of faith? Is there a difficult truth in a relationship that God's saying you need to speak up? You need to say the truth? Or is God saying, let's rebuild that prayer life? No condemnation, no guilt. You promised I'm going to pray every day or I'm going to pray in the morning, and it didn't follow through, and God's saying, let's take a next step. Daniel's legacy wasn't built in a day. It was built over a lifetime. And for some of us, we hear a message like this and we think, oh, that would have been great when I was 20. It would have been great when I was 30. It would have been great before I made this mistake. It would have been great before these things happened with my kids. But it's too late. There's a phrase we use at our church all the time. From this day forward. From this day forward. God is not here to condemn you for your past. We ask for his forgiveness, we're forgiven. God is saying, what is your step today toward the legacy that you will leave for the next generation? Can I pray with you guys? Lord, I am so thankful for the legacy that I have from my grandfather, from my father, from my family. And Lord, I know that so many times I have come short of stewarding that legacy. But Lord, you are faithful. And Lord, I pray for those who are here today. Chuck talked about Father's Day being a tough day. It can be so bad. Many of us didn't receive a legacy from our father. Some of us are not in a place where we can leave a legacy to our own children. But Lord, every one of us, man or woman, can take a step today that will impact the next generation. Lord, give us wisdom and guide us in your name.